All right, we're now going to be learning some new trig identities. There's the sum and difference, the double and half angle identities. And when we're solving these, here is the big tip. You have to, what you need to keep in mind is you'll be relying on the unit circle, angles. The pi fourths, the pi thirds, pi sixths, pi halves, pi's. That's what this is. You're going to be relying on those. Anyway, so the sum and difference identity for sine is if you have one angle, say like pi thirds, plus or minus, say, pi fourths. So two different angles. Here's the identity. You take the sine of the first. So let's call this one the first and this one the second. You take sine of the first and multiply it by cosine of the second, and then you take cosine of the first and you multiply that by sine of the second. And if you're adding in here, then you add here. If you're subtracting here, you subtract here. So let's get started on that. So notice 7 pi twelfths is not on the unit circle. So we have to come up with two numbers added together, two numbers that are on the unit circle that add up to 7 pi twelfths. Well, what about 4 pi twelfths and 3 pi twelfths? They add up to 7 pi twelfths, and then look at what can happen. 4 and 12, 4 cancels to 1, 12 cancels to 3. So now we have, oh, look at pi thirds. And then 3 cancels to 1, 12 cancels to 4. Oh, look at pi fourths. So now we have sine of pi thirds plus pi fourths, and we can plug it into this where we're going to take sine of pi thirds times cosine of pi fourths plus cosine of pi thirds times sine of pi fourths. So that's what we're going to do here. So see, sine of the first, make sure I'm coloring, sine of the first, cosine of the first, just like that. And then you can just look at the unit circle. So unless you haven't memorized, sine of pi thirds is root 3 over 2 times cosine of pi fourths is root 2 over 2 plus, since there was a plus sign, we're going to put a plus sign here, cosine of pi thirds is 1/2, sine of pi fourths is root 2 over 2, and then look at these two things are being multiplied. 2 times 2 is 4. Root 3 times root 2 is root 6. And then over here, 1 times root 2 is root 2. And 2 times 2 is 4. Well, now we have these two fractions that are being added that share the denominator. So when we simplify that, we can write it over one fraction. Root 6 plus root 2 all over 4. All right, it's going to be very similar with cosine. The only difference is, notice this is very key. If it's being added here, it's going to be subtracted here. Or if there is a subtract sign here, there will be an add sign. And then look at these two things. It's cosine of the first times cosine of the second times sine of the first times sine of the second. So that, but everything else is essentially the same process. You look at the unit circle. So 13 pi 12s is not on the unit circle. So we need to think about two things that would add up to pi 12. So I think I chose 9 pi 12s and 4 pi 12s. Well, 9 and 12 have a 3 in common. That would leave 3. That would 3 pi over 4. And then 4 pi over 12. That just cancels to pi thirds again. And I think that's what I did. Yeah. So they both share a 3. That cancels to 3. That cancels to 4. So 3 pi fourths is the first. And that cancels to 1. That cancels to 3. So pi thirds is the second. And then it's going to be cosine of the first times cosine of the second. That's a plus sign. So there will be a subtract sign here. So again, here's our first. Here's our first. Our second and our second. And then you just use this unit circle. So memorizing the unit circle is very useful because you wouldn't be able to figure these out on a test situation if you did not have those unit circle values memorized, or at least figure out a way to derive them. All right, so we take cosine of 3 pi fourths. Well, 3 pi fourths is over here where cosine is negative, and all of the pi fourths are root 2 over root 2. It just so happens that in this quadrant for cosine it's negative. So we have negative root 2 over 2. And cosine of pi thirds is 1/2. So that's times 1/2. Then we have a subtract sign. Sine of 3 pi fourths is root 2 over 2 times sine of pi thirds, which is root 3 over 2, which is what I have right down here. And then you're just going to multiply those out. Negative root 2 times 1 is negative root 2 over 4. And then that's a subtract sign. Root 6 over 4. These now can share the same denominator, which is what I have here. And then look at, they both share a negative sign. So sometimes what's going to happen is professors are going to prefer that you factor out that negative sign and then rewrite it like this. These two things mean the exact same thing. All right, really quickly, we're going to go over tangent. Tangent is a different beast than the other ones. So if this is a plus sign, here will be a plus sign, but down here it will be the opposite. So for tangent, if you have a plus here, you'll have a plus here and a subtract here. But if you have a subtract inside here, you'll have a subtract here and you'll have a plus here. So be careful about that. And then look at, it's tangent of the first plus or minus tangent of the second. Then down below, it's the opposite sign, tangent of the first times the tangent of the second. So again, we have pi twelfths. Well, this is going to be a subtraction problem because that's just 1 pi twelfths. So I think I went with 4 pi twelfths, subtract 3 pi twelfths, and then those cancel to pi thirds, because that cancels to 1 over 3, that cancels to 1 over. So pi thirds subtract pi fourths, and then, so here's our first, here's our second. So tangent of pi thirds subtract tangent of pi fourths. These signs agree. And then since that subtract, down here will be a plus sign. Then 1 plus tangent pi thirds times tangent pi fourths. Tricky thing about this is that when you look at the unit circle, all of these values are the cosines and the sines. Well, remember, tangent is sine over cosine. So when you look at pi thirds, remember pi thirds is up here. Well, cosine is 1/2 and sine is root 3 over 2. So when you want to find the tangent, you have to do root 3 over 2 over 1/2, and then you multiply top and bottom by 2 over 1. So tangent of pi thirds ends up being positive root 3. And then pi fourths, well, look at pi fourths, cosine and sine are the same. So what do you get when you divide a number by itself? That's going to cancel to 1. And then look at what you do down here. It's just root 3 times 1. So I think I put all of that in. So we have root 3 subtract 1 over 1 plus root 3 times 1. And most of the time, so it would be tangent of pi 12ths. I'm okay if you leave it like this. Some professors would maybe want you to simplify further by multiplying by the conjugate. But for what we're doing right now, I'm okay if you leave it just like that. All right, we're done with the sum difference identities.